shut. The world at night. It's a cool poster, and it's taking a second to load because it's also recording. Okay, so basically, this is all about history, and I said there were three main periods that we're talking about, which is the pre-colonial era, or the Age of Kingdoms. Then we have the colonial era, and then we have the modern era. Now, there's problems that happen throughout all of this. First up, with the Age of Kingdoms, there's literally so many we couldn't name them all. Some of them were based on trade, such as Ghana and the Songhai. Others, like Fujian, were independently wealthy. Some farmed gold. Which, if you think about, Egypt was really heavily using gold this era. A lot for art, also trade. And this is sort of one of the important things in the development of trade, because for the most part, the earliest form of trade is people simply taking one thing and exchanging it for something else. Say I'm a farmer and you're a metal worker. I need someone to reshoe my horses. You need someone to give you food. We just trade it. We work out the price between how much work you have to do to get how much, with my crops, and we work it out. That's a really basic but also really inefficient means of exchange. For instance, think about coming to school here, right? Your parents would essentially have to take whatever their trade is and trade it to the school or to us individually as teachers who would exchange knowledge, and it just gets really confusing all of a sudden. The introduction of a currency, something like gold, or in some cases even more abstract terms of currency, helps us to trade without actually having to trade something physical other beyond something that we can agree upon as worth. Take that to the next level, and we can exchange essentially useless paper. If you look at a dollar bill, it's just essentially fabric and little bits and bobs that aren't really worth anything, but we acknowledge that it does, and so it works. So trade, important. Now, here's what happened. As you guys know, Columbus was seeking a way to get here. Okay? Why? What do you want from India, China, this area? Yeah.
Spices,
Sure.
silk, and like gold and stuff.
Sure. So why were they wanting to go around? Because they could get that stuff, they could import it from here, but what's the problem? Yeah.
People that they didn't want to get involved with were over there.
Sure. They didn't want to have to pay the middleman. You guess what the middleman is? Basically, raw material gets to you through somebody else. For instance,
Middleman.
right, the person in the middle, sure. So that means the price goes up. Every time that product changes hands, that price goes up and up and up and up and up and up. I mean, if you think about it this way, it actually only costs Apple about $10 to make an iPhone, right? But they sell it for hundreds because of marketing. But no, it is because the middleman and everything else like that. Sure, that's called marketing. So they want to get around that. They want to get straight to the source. Okay, here's the problem. There's a big old freaking comet, right? So here's why that's a major problem. This is before refrigeration, right? We cannot store food that'll last more than like a couple of weeks. The only ways of really preserving food at the time was pickling, I don't know how much you guys like pickles, smoking, so like think beef jerky, or salting the hell out of it. They actually had a type of bread called hardtack or ship's biscuits that is essentially dough with salt, heavy amounts of salt, and no yeast. And you dry it to the point where it's like hard, right? And you can't just bite into hardtack, because if you do, it's kind of like chewing on a board. It's no good. The best way of eating hardtack is to put it in like a warm liquid, like a soup or coffee, if you feel particularly great, and you just let it sit for a minute. It starts to kind of hydrate and kind of sucks it all up, and then you can finally start chewing. I actually lived on hardtack for a weekend as part of a historical reenactment. And other than the salt intake, which was unbelievably high, it wasn't actually all that bad. I actually gave Mr. Householder one after the event, and he still has it sitting in his desk somewhere, and it's 5 or 6 years old now. It's still perfectly good. Now, that being said, if this is what you're living on, you're going to have problems. You guys know what scurvy is? Scurvy is a disease where you have a vitamin C deficiency. Because if you don't have enough fruits and vegetables, you start getting this disease. And basically what happens is your gums start bleeding, your teeth start falling out, your skin starts sagging, you get really grouchy, and you die. So it's a bad thing. In fact, it kind of became a nautical thing to say someone's scurvy, something they're saying if they're mean, kind of mean. It's like a scurvy seagull or things like that. So, here's the problem. We need food, we need supplies, we need water, right? So, Henry the Navigator, the son of the King of Portugal, says, hey, let's set up little forts of outposts on the coast of Africa, and then we can get to India. We can just kind of hop, skip our way over. This is an 11-month journey one way, right? So that's a long time. You're sailing on one of these expeditions you buy for 2 years, right? It's a long time. Well, eventually it works. So what happens is the natives of these various kingdoms, because the thing is, I think, again, we have this idea, it's just a whole bunch of tribes and there's no unification. It's not true at all. There's kingdoms around it. Decide that, hey, there's a European stopping over, that's cool, we'll trade with them, no big deal. But the Europeans aren't going into the interior. The one thing Europeans had that Africans didn't was guns. Firearms hadn't been developed anywhere else, except for China in the Ottoman Empire. And so essentially, these new weapons revolutionized warfare. And so the Africans are like, well, we'll trade you these guns for stuff. And the Europeans are like, we don't really want to give you lots of guns. So they restricted it, we'll only trade slaves for guns. Now, there wasn't really a huge hunger for slavery yet. We'll get to what that happens in a minute. So trade going back here is dominated by Portugal. Spain wants to get in on the action, as is the rest of the European powers. But England has already taken some areas, France has taken some areas. And there's this crazy guy who says, hey, we should go this way. If we go this way, we can go all around this, and we'll make it all the way around the world. China, no big deal, right?
That's going to be a big deal because there's a lot of water.
Well, here's the thing about that. Most people are like, oh, everyone thought the world was flat. No, very few people thought the world was flat. Most people just assumed the world was bigger than Columbus was saying it was. Because if you think about it, what's the problem? Why do we need these outposts? Food, right? If you just start setting sail this way, you better hope you get somewhere before you run out of food or you all die, right? So when Columbus and his men were having that problem where they were going to meet me, they were going to kill me, they were going to sail back home, it wasn't because you're going to drop us off the face here. It was, we're running out of food, dude. We got to get home or we're going to die. So that's what that was all. Columbus just happened to get lucky and run into something. And this sparked a whole new thing. You see, whereas this area has spices, this area has gold. Right?
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's all over this place. Mexico, the Aztec that lived there, the whole reason they were conquered was gold. Hence their Christianity, hence the golden god of the conquistadors. But mining gold sucks. It's deep underground, takes a lot of labor. So Cortez is like, we'll enslave all the Aztec. The problem is that they have these diseases they brought with them, like smallpox and malaria. So the natives die off en masse and almost made extinct in some places. And so they're like, crap, we got to get labor. Hey, wasn't there a place that they were offering free labor or cheap labor for guns? Thus beginning the transatlantic slave trade. Eventually, the Europeans will push into the African interior because as this continues, Europe undergoes through an industrial revolution. That's where you would basically take the work of humans and animals in the place of machines, which makes it more efficient, but you need more raw materials. You need gas, you need iron, you need coal, all those different things. And Africa has a lot of it, but it's in the interior. So the armies of Europe go into the interior, but, as I said, there's all these kingdoms. If you just try to invade a kingdom, you're going to get smacked down by that kingdom. Because remember, these guys have been building up supplies of guns as well. So Europe can't just go steamroll throughout Africa. So what happens is they divide and conquer. They put various enemies together, and what happens is they meet at Berlin in 1884 to discuss who gets to invade what part of Africa and sort of divide it up like a pizza amongst a bunch of people at a party. And each person gets a certain number of slices depending on where they're going to go. So inevitably, Africa falls under the colonial rule of these European powers. As time progressed, the European powers started to fail, largely due to World War I and World War II. So they started to pull out of these countries, also because of the importance of self-determination. It's the belief that every nation needs to rule for itself. But there's also this problem, well, we can't just like say, all right, peace out, see ya, because their entire economy has been set up to feed raw materials in these European powers. If you just cut that off, now you have massive amounts of starvation because people aren't selling, they're not working. You have massive problems with who's in charge now, and so tribal leaders will fight enemy tribes, because remember, Europe had broken up these areas to make certain that those tribal enemies are together, and you have absolute chaos, which is what brings us into the modern era, because a lot of these places don't really have self-rule, or if they do, it's somewhat tenuous. Some places are better off than others. But a lot of cases we have problems. Like Egypt just went through its own little revolution with the Arab Spring. Somalia has had problems with warlords and pirates for years. Ethiopia is much the same way. It's not exactly a good place. The amount of civil strife that's happened throughout Africa is just unbelievable. I mean, the devastation to human beings is just outlandish. Not to mention other problems that they face. But we'll get to that later. This is a paper or newspaper clipping from the conference in Berlin. And notice the very caricaturous picture of an African person down there. The attitudes of the 1800s was basically wildly racist, and racism was essentially accepted as truth. In particular, there's this belief of the superiority of certain races, and of course that leads all kinds of issues. This is a continuation of the same section, so just keep reference. All right, so most people in Africa speak at least 2 languages. Many of them speak a European language as well as regional dialects. And what language they speak is largely dependent on the European power that settled there. For instance, Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, was settled by France. You can tell that from the French, so they speak French. Go to places like South Africa, what was settled by England, English is the main language there. If you were to say go to Morocco or Egypt, Arabic is the main language spoken there. Now you might be like, well, that's not a European country. That's because a lot of that area was initially settled by Arabs. So the Bedouins, the folks coming in from Saudi Arabia, and so there, and even like the Moors who came into Spain, a lot of the area was really more Middle Eastern, and for a long time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which you might think, well, that's a Central Asian power, but it's also in Europe. In fact, there's 2 countries that are split between Europe and Asia. One is Turkey, because it's literally on the Bosphorus, splitting between what we think of as the European area and Asia. You guys know what the other one is? What other country is both European and Asian? Your thoughts? What other country is both European and Asian? The map might help you. Russia. Look at Russia is actually stretched into. Most maps of the world will actually show a dividing line along the Balkan Mountains that's divided between Europe and Asia. Now, that being said, when you get into the other languages, oh man, it can branch. There was one young lady who I met who spoke 7 languages. It was about your age. Now, most of them were very similar regional dialects of Bantu, which is the largest language family in Africa. It's still incredibly impressive when you think about it. Now, as far as life in Africa today, a lot of it is tribal-based. And let's talk about what a tribe is. Okay, a tribe is everybody who shares a family relation to a common famous ancestor. So generally speaking, actually let me think about that. No, that's wrong. It's a group of families. I mean to say that are tied together by family relations. Technically the description has to be the clan, but it's close. Essentially tribes are families. That's the thing to remember. And this group has always looked to each other for mutual survival and success. If you think about it, if something really goes heavily wrong in your life, usually it's family that's going to be the ones who help you out. But if you think about it, we in the United States tend to really focus more on our nuclear or central family, and our aunts and uncles, that sort of thing, being the farthest extent, not like 3 cousins twice removed and things like that. That's not so much the case with tribes. Tribes are like everyone you're related to, pretty much involved, all working together. Now the problem is that when you add into the situation limited resources, where the stresses are much higher, it can create major problems of us versus them. Because remember, these tribes have been enemies in many cases for centuries. So in places where you might have a civil war, it's often based on tribal identity, in some cases religious identity. For instance, have you guys heard of Darfur in Sudan? That's been a while, so it wouldn't surprise me. I can kind of think of it, it might have been before you were born. Anyways, it was a bit of ethnic cleansing, civil war, where one ethnic group, one religious group, attempted to annihilate another ethnic group, the Western Sudan. And basically, it was one group of Muslims killing off another group of Muslims. So, anyways, it's often tribal. Many of these places are stateless societies. That's not to say that there aren't governments. There is government. There's certainly police and things like that. But for day-to-day wrongs and rights and figuring out who's what and things like that, it's actually settled by tribal leaders. It's your family members, essentially. So it'd be like you have a problem with your cousin, you go to the eldest male member of the family and say, this is a problem, solve our problem, please, and they will. So essentially, it's the government is your family. That makes sense. It also makes democracy incredibly difficult because whenever you have 2 different parties, 2 different groups that can't get along or refuse to work together, the government doesn't work, does it? Look at our government right now, right? We have 2 diametrically opposed political parties who are refusing to work. It's a polarized government. That's easy mode compared to when you have the tribes, because remember, they've been in these for centuries. Our political parties haven't even existed that long. So, when you add hundreds of years of history behind that, it makes it even trickier to get the parties to get along. Today, for most Africans, it's sort of a mix of Western culture and traditional African culture. It largely depends on where you are. And that cannot be stressed heavily enough. If we're talking about in the middle of the rural community, it's going to be much poorer than say, the city. People living in cities and big cities, things like that, they have more or less a modern life compared to what we expect. And the thing is, technology has made it even smaller. I mean, it's possible for folks who are working in farms, things like that, to have cell phones. Think about what that means. That means they can communicate with the world, right? They can know about things. And that also means they're more politically active. They can understand things and understand where we're coming from as opposed to just where they're living. Now, that being said, in some places they don't have it. Some places they don't have electricity. So their life hasn't really changed than what it has been for hundreds of years. So we're talking about really kind of different places. We're looking at different distributions of wealth. There is a tremendous amount of income inequality in these places. The rich are just as rich as people in Europe or in America. They're incredibly wealthy individuals. And the poor are just unbelievably poor. We're talking, making $116 a year. And that's what they have to live on. It's poverty on a scale that's hard to believe. This also means that medical care is really heavily dependent on where you are. One of my wife's coworkers was on vacation in the Serengeti and got stepped on by an elephant. Basically took her foot and broke it, folded it in half, and wrapped it around her. Basically, her foot got wrapped around her leg, essentially. And so what happened is that she was in the middle of the bush. They had to throw her on the back of a Jeep, drive her 8 hours to get to the nearest city where they didn't have enough medical care to treat her. So they ended up basically filling her full of morphine, put her on an airplane to send her to another major city where they didn't have enough stuff to treat her. So they filled her with more morphine, shoved her on a plane to France, and got her medical treatment.
It must have been difficult for that.
Yes. Well, the thing is, her husband also worked with my wife, and was essentially like, I don't have a passport. I need to get to Africa now. So he had an interesting time with the CIA and FBI trying to get his passport.
Did he get it?
Yes.
My mom's there.
He had to fly to Washington, D.C. to do it, but he did. All right, so this shows the various language family groups found in Africa. And oh boy, when you're talking about the differences in languages, think about how hard it is for us to get along with people of different political ideologies, and we speak the same language. Yes? So it's really hard for places to function. Another thing I tend to find, and again, let's talk about differences here. Most people, when they think people living in Africa, they're probably thinking like this, yes?
No.
What were you thinking?
A lot of animals.
Well,
There's a lot of animals in Africa.
Africa, yes, there's a lot of animals everywhere. Think about it.
No,
But I mean, think about housing. Like, think about what kind of houses people live in. Like, people I find tend to think something like this because you think of the zoo, like the little zoo, they got the little hut. It's like an African hut that people live in. This is true. Some people have lived in these, and this is kind of traditional thatch-roof things like that. But this is also very, very common. Much more common, I'd say. In fact, talking homes essentially made of the same material, repeat it over and over and over and over and over. It's efficient, it's easy, and it's cheap. Now that being said, this is also somebody's home in Africa.
Sounds expensive.
It is. Don't know how much it would cost to live there exactly, but it's pretty high. Now that being said, cost of living is different from places to places. That's one of the reasons we're doing this project. But I want you to see, if we're just taking the average amount of money we make in America and apply it to other places, what kind of lifestyle would you have? Because I'm gonna tell you right now, it's gonna be different. I've had people shocked by that. For instance, some folks moving to like Cambodia, and they're working for a U.S. firm, things that are making the same money they make here, and comparatively they're like millionaires. I mean, not exactly, but like they're like, well, you should get a maid, that way you don't have to clean your house, things like that. How much is that going to cost? That takes about $10 a month. It's like, okay, that's a live-in maid, fine. Things like that. It's just unbelievable the difference in the way we live. It also is one of the reasons why a lot of places like this have become tourist attractions. I remember my parents telling me when they went to Thailand, the hotel they went to, there's like a 5-star hotel that they got was $60 a night. And like when they got there, like the people were just rushing around, like, is there anything you need? Like, here, you've carried this bag, let me get it for you. And here's a drink, so you wipe your brow, things like that. Would you like a massage? All this kind of stuff like that. Just kind of. It's a whole other level of living. Now that being said, there's also problems in some of these areas because the amount of wealth coming from tourists also means that they really don't want to get the tourists away, and so crime becomes a problem. For instance, underage prostitution is a tremendous problem in places like Cambodia because essentially people will go there and that's the reason they go there. So fighting that while not pushing tourism out is kind of an issue for some of these countries. Not to mention human trafficking is a tremendous issue throughout the world. But all right, any questions on this? Are we good? Okay. This is also kind of slightly partner with what Mr. House was talking to you guys about, because one of the things I want you guys to see is Africa as it is, not just these stereotypes, not just talk about AIDS and poverty and all these really terrible things, because that makes it seem like everyone in Africa is miserable all the time, and that's simply not true. In fact, one of the kind of simple pleasures in Africa is simply talking, telling stories, engaging with people, things like that. It's something we've lost somewhat in our society today because we don't have to. We have other means of entertainment, but if you think about it, one of the oldest ways that people have formed relationships with each other is by simply communicating. It's almost a lost art in some cases. I'm going to stop the recording there. Do you guys have any questions?